So good evening and welcome to Copperfields Books virtual event with Leslie Kirk Campbell in conversation with Scott Landers. My name's Jamie Madsen. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here and will also be your host for the evening. So just a couple notes before we dive in. The format will feature between 35 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. Please go ahead and submit any questions or comments you have for tonight's speakers under that icon. And the other thing is to keep an eye on your chat box because I will be sharing discount codes, links where to buy tonight's title, previous titles, and all of the likes. So I will be chatting with you there. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's author. Leslie Kirk Campbell's award-winning stories have appeared in Arts and Letters, Briar Cliff Review, Southern Indian Review, and the Thomas Wolfe Review. The mother of two grown sons, she is the author of Journey into Motherhood, Writing Your Way to Self-Discovery. She is currently a director and master teacher at Ripe Fruit Writing, a creative writing program that she founded in San Francisco in 1991. And in conversation with Leslie is Scott Landers, whose short stories have appeared in the New England Review, West Branch, Other Voices, among many other. He recently completed his third novel and hopes to have a second one done by the year's end. Once a proud resident of San Francisco, he now huddles on a scorched hillside overlooking Healdsburg. So they're with us tonight to discuss Leslie's award-winning title, The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs. And I'm so thrilled to hand it over to you, Leslie. Why don't you get us started?
Okay. Well, I have to say thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to be reading from my debut fiction collection, The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs. If you don't have it yet, it's probably on its way, or she'll give you opportunities to buy it during our time together. This is my second event. I had a launch in San Francisco a couple days ago. I am in San Francisco myself, and I'm very excited. Everything is all very new, and here we go. So I just chose to read. This is The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, and there's 8 stories in this book. Okay, and 6 of them are quite long, and then a couple of them are short. So I decided to read a short one because I can read the whole one, read it to completion, and it also takes place in Sonoma County. So I know a lot of you are from Sonoma County who are here today, and so I wanted to honor the Aina, the land, the place where you live. So this is called The Hermit's Tattoo. It starts with a quote, a fictional quote, which is, "Sometimes I wonder why anyone is saved." Brother Augustine. And I want to say one thing before I start, actually. I always like to encourage people to close their eyes when they're listening to a reading, because then you're not distracted by people's faces and other things. But it's totally up to you. I think of every story as a kind of narrative dream, and we usually close our eyes when we dream. The Hermit's Tattoo. The back road that October night, blistered with heat and smoke as it curved through the valley like a river. Behind me, the place of my silence, a place that was never itself silent, nor had I been able to make it so. When I gardened or prayed or drew water from the well, I'd hear the wing wind of the 2 resident ravens and their gurgling deep-throated calls, the rapid knocking of woodpeckers ramming thumb-sized holes into the lone telephone pole, the twitter of swallows and sparrows in the blue oak limbs. At dusk, the bullfrogs belched out their pain and lust like drunk bastards on a street corner. After my evening meal, I often sat on my deck and listened to their existential hollering, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." Their insistence felt brutal, but I could imagine a time when they would not be here, nor would anything that survives on chlorophyll or a heartbeat. The land was loquacious, but not that night. That night, the valley animals were stunned mute. Blazing fires crowned the Sonoma Hills to the north and east before sheeting down slope 400 yards a minute, leaping over gullies and glens, fanned by Diablo winds. There'd been no rain in the land. A drought is upon her waters, wrote Jeremiah, and they shall be dried up, for it is the land of graven images, and they are mad upon their idols. The rapid knocking had been the fireman waking me from a dream, his helmet off, sweat clinging to his bushy brow. He was shouting, telling me to leave the hermitage that housed a decade of my prayers in its eaves and as many misgivings. How many times had I watched the fish in the lily pond dart and glide like the rapacious thoughts I attempted daily to replace with God's voice? I listened harder, knelt longer in my tiny chapel, repeated the solemn vows which forbade me mourn or treasure her. But I could not shed the world. Until that day last spring, when God himself arrived, foot soldier and king, at my doorstep and forgave my flawed call to holiness. He granted me, as part of his bargain, the ancient ritual of celebration, penance for having loved someone more than him. Leave everything, the fireman yelled when I went to grab my Carthusian robe from a hook. There was no time to save my miniatures, Our Lady of Refuge and St. John on the Cross. My battered pickup rattled down the road between walls of flame. I thought of my two friends, the ravens who mated every year in a different valley, but always brought their brood to mine to feed and learn to fly. I fed them what I could not eat, leftover quinoa and kale from my garden. They were sky animals. They didn't require superhero escapes from the blazes as did the brazen frogs and the lizards, jackrabbits, coyote, voles, and wild bear. I hadn't smelled the fire as I slept, immersed as I'd been in my dreaming. A small town in New Hampshire, a little girl, a red tricycle buried in the snow. The fireman hadn't meant to rake my wound, the skin red and raw beneath my nightshirt, where I'd rubbed salt into my tattoo that morning in a third attempt to erase her name. The tricycle had gone missing from her garage, and I, at 5, had found it for her that New England winter before the warmth of spring could beat me to it. She opened the door, her hair in 2 long braids, which she crossed against her chest without utterance. I've wondered if such kinder love is supposed to endure. But it did endure, even when at 12 she moved away, even as I began to hear God's call. My heart, a red hot crucible, finally cooled during my silent years at Grande Chartreuse Hermitage in Grenoble, only to heat up once more my 30th year when I learned that she had died. Sta crux dum bovitur orbis. The cross is steady while the world is turning. A flaming tree fell across the road, barely missing my hood. The car in front of me backed up. 2 young men, like gods themselves, jumped out carrying axes, split the fallen trunk, and heaved the fiery chunks to either side with their bare hands, risking their lives to save mine. Why had no one saved my childhood friend? At 6, we dared each other to run under fat bellies of cows at pasture, sprayed each other with hoses in the middle of the street, climbed along connecting fences like raccoons as if we owned our cul-de-sac. At 9, we perched high in an elm and read Gunnar Lind's The White Stone, imagining we were the boy and girl with secret names. At 12, lying on our backs in the grass, she shared her flying dreams, and as she spoke, almost a song, I left the earth and soared with her over slopes of golden birch and crimson dogwood, our town's tiny roofs and steeples far below. Blessed is the woman unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. She who had left me twice, and now again, this last time, from my own skin. A quiet child, I'd sat on the curb and watched her family pile into their green station wagon, packed to the roof with their belongings. Chastity is the most radical poverty, Merton wrote. At word of her death, I snuck out of Grand Chartreuse by cover of night and walked to Rue d'Enfer-Rochereux, where I paid an artist to tattoo her name in large Gothic letters diagonally across my chest, then hid the graven image beneath my robe. As I fled the fire, I held the damp cloth the fireman had given me over my mouth. Cast all memory of the world behind you, said Saint Bruno. Your cell will teach you everything. Penance, I learned, is a process. You must abrade the tattoo 6 times. Each time, the outer layers of skin rub off. You bandage the wound. Each lesion takes 8 weeks to heal. Everywhere in the hills and valleys, sparks were lighting 1,000 spot fires. The shelter was bustling with dogs and families, cases of bottled water, Cheerios, respirators, and cots. I stammered when spoken to and kept to myself. On the 3rd day, in an outdoor shower, a county towel wrapped around my waist, a young boy saw the tattoo I was scrubbing out. What's that? He asked. A crowd of children appeared, 12 of them, boys and girls, all homeless now, astonished to see I had Chloe's faded name, red with rubbing, writ large like a sash from my shoulder to my waist. It's gone, I said. I'd drawn the ink out with salt. No, it's not, they said. It's there. That evening, they followed me like kittens swatting at trailing yarn. Why are you bald? They asked. How old are you? Who's Chloe? And I answered them. I made pancakes for 50 people for 3 weeks straight. I told ribald jokes about monastics. When I returned home in my pickup truck, it was to slopes of blackness. Any tree without charred limbs was an aberration. There were no hens crowing at the bottom of the hill, no finches twittering in the olive trees. Everything that hadn't burned had left. But my modest hut and chapel were still there. The Bible opened to Psalm 32, just as I'd left it during my last evening prayer. Along the singed railing of my deck, I hung the damp boxer shorts and faded blue t-shirts that a family had donated to the shelter, washed and rinsed with water from the well. I sat facing east and watched the strawberry moon rise over the large metal cross on the hill that I'd mounted between stones the year I arrived. My chest, itself a cratered moonscape, would always hold Chloe's name. I slipped my hand beneath my robe and felt each letter thick with layers of new skin. It wasn't the first time I'd been overcome. The job of the monk is to weep, not to teach, said Pope John. The Carthusians said, destroy yourself completely. Ash, it turns out, is an aphrodisiac for wildflowers and grasses. The dead amongst the living living better than before. I made my potato soup and washed the pot, the bowl and the spoon. I waited in the valley's silence, without expectation, as the carbonized earth around me reincarnated into a sweet, belligerent green. Then one day, one of the ravens came back with her 4-foot wingspan and said in raven speak, I missed you, Brother Augustine, missed your quinoa and kale. The airborne were saved and they came back. And perhaps because they came back, everything came back. The bullfrogs and rabbits and voles.
I like the belligerent green part. It's a great line. I should point out that that this story is a central, the narrator and central character is a religious person, but most of the stories are not about religiously oriented people, though there are a number of different spiritual crises happening in this collection of stories amongst the characters. And I should also reiterate that most of the stories in this collection are long and wonderfully complex. They're multi-layered, multiple points of view. They're almost like small novels in a way. So I guess my initial, I know that a lot of people don't read short stories these days. Once upon a time, writers like Scott Fitzgerald made a pretty healthy living just selling short stories to dozens of mainstream magazines across the US and elsewhere.
Yeah, Chekhov did too.
Yeah, I mean, in 1929, I mean, Fitzgerald sold a number of stories to Saturday Evening Post at what in today's dollars would be like $60,000 a pop, because that was a popular form of entertainment then. But nowadays, even readers of literary fiction, like ourselves, may not be that familiar with what's going on in the realm of short fiction, which is quite interesting these days. It's a good time to tune in. But I wonder if you might tell us briefly why you are drawn to this particular form specifically. What are short stories? What do they allow you to do as a writer, and what do you think they deliver to a reader that longer forms of fiction might not necessarily be able to do?
Well, I'm not going to talk about novels so much or what people get from novels versus short fiction, but I can tell you why I am attracted to the short story as a genre and have felt only attracted to, have had no interest in doing anything else now. And so as I've cut my teeth on learning fiction, having gone back to get my MFA in my 50s and starting fiction so late in life, I've really wanted to explore the genre of short fiction. It's partially because I am a poet at heart. I been a poet since I was a kid, and I did my master's in poetry, read poetry, did poetry readings. And as a teacher of creative writing, I teach people to know what a poet knows about language. One thing, and so some of the things that are true about poetry are also true about the short story. There is an amazing compression that can happen. There's for me, each short story is a work of art, like a poem is, and it has its musical aspect, its orchestration, its rhythms, its crescendos, its legatos, its refrains and echoes, its rhyming, and I love that it's not just rhyming musically, the language, but it's also rhyming of ideas, rhyming of some sort of image that's then repeated. So I find it's this intricate, oh, here, I have this right here. I don't know so people can see it. This is Marie Antoinette's watch that the famous French watchmaker Breguet made, and it's called Le Grande Complication. And when I saw that, I said, shit, that's what I'm doing, or that's what I want to do. Every one is a complication. So no wonder some people feel like each one is like a novel. So because there's a lot you can get in. Another thing I was thinking of, I thought of is there's a deliciousness in omission. A novel sprawls on and can go on tangents in all these different places. But in poetry, there are these leaps of idea, leaps of faith. And I was just reading something today about how, you leave almost nothing in a short story. You work it until it's supposedly like this. All the little pieces are all working. Some of them chiming, some of them telling time, and so I find that very, very exciting. And another reason I'll just have to mention is that I personally am a person who traveled, was basically forced to move about 6 different cities by the time I was 15, 8 different schools, had to always make new friends. And then I sort of had the bug of this restlessness afterwards, and then ended up living in Italy, spending a year in Asia because my father was working there, and I've been with so many kinds of people. I needed to write stories, I'm too eclectic to just like stay with one story for 500 pages.
Let's see.
It really gives me a lot of chance to explore a lot of different ideas. I also, ideas in my head and situations and people.
I have to say that the watch is an interesting analogy to the way your stories work, though I would, because they're very precise. But at the same time, I think your stories are very organic, and they kind of basically flow from an emotional place. And it's not a mechanism I'm really dealing with when I read one of your stories.
Yeah.
The story you just read us is about a monk and kind of going through a spiritual crisis. He's processing stuff from his past that's obviously been a burden for him. The title story of the collection, The Man with 8 Pairs of Legs, centers partly around a lonely female protagonist, Harriet, who, as a result of finding a new love with a man with artificial legs, ends up struggling with her own body image and having to confront a kind of a dark chapter in her past when she was into self-harming. And another story you have in this collection, Nightlight, we have a male protagonist, Reiner, a man of German descent, born in Germany, living in San Francisco, who befriends a homeless man squatting in the empty building next to his. And his relationship with this homeless man, the squatter, largely nocturnal. He's sort of a secret sharer character, but it leads Reiner down this very dark hole towards a very different kind of self-harming. For Reiner, it's a spiritual crisis, I believe, and not one of body image, but this feeling that he's not living an authentic life, that he sort of turned his back on things that were really important to him. There's a lot of philosophy in this story, a lot of Heidegger and poetry. But in both stories, it seems to me that the impulse to destruction, the characters have to face in themselves this impulse to destruction before they can even get to a place where happiness might again be possible to them. And I think I see this pattern in other stories in this collection. I often get the sense of a character skirting an abyss or or staring down in one. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that. When you sit down to write a story, and I should add that these stories, they deal with darkness, but they don't end. They usually end on a kind of a hopeful note. They're you're left as a. I think that's one of the powerful things about this collection is that you're left with this sense of a possibility that things can work out. But when you sit down to write a story, I'm wondering now, do you necessarily start with an explicit predicament, a psychological predicament or a spiritual predicament? Or do these kind of conflicts just arise by themselves as you work through the material?
Well, it's different for every story. But just thinking about the ones that you've mentioned, Nightlight and The Man with the 8 Pairs of Legs. Nightlight started, I don't think I ever start with an idea of a psychological conflict, for example. That comes later. Later. Nightlight started with a dream I had. And I saw this middle-class man with his arm around what I thought was a homeless heroin addict going down the street, and he was leaving his house. And I saw his wife was at the window watching them as the sun rose, which is not in the story now, but it was that dream. And I thought, how can he do that? He's leave his wife and his child. I mean, what's going on? I had to follow him, sort of go down that rabbit hole, you could say. I was curious, like, what was making this man leave everything behind for something, for what something so different. And then I did realize, I mean, it came together that it was an intellectual connection between them. And although that image was a dream, it ended up relating to my own experience, my own excitement, my own thrill of when my intellect spark plugs are firing, and how an experience I had once was when a potential student called me. Actually, he was calling me from the Santa Rosa region. I remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we were talking on the phone, and he was saying things about some liminal space, and talking about Eugenio Montale, the Nobel Prize winning Italian poet's poem I Limoni. And it was orgasmic on the phone. It was like, so I just felt that there's a lust, there's a seduction in the intellect. And I feel it myself. I said, oh, if I call this guy back, I might leave my husband. So it was all, and so I didn't call him back in my case. But in fiction, you can explore things more thoroughly and really kind of see where it takes you. So I think it's a combination. It's always a combination of things, of actual things that happen and that one feels and it fascinates one. And then also it could be like a dream. In 8 Pairs of Legs, it was a photo I just happened to see in a TED's talk of all these prosthetics all against the wall, and I said, and that really, I saw it, but it was years later. I mean, I just sort of riveted it by that, and it stayed with me. And so when it came time to when my children were more grown and I started writing fiction, learning how to write fiction, trying to learn how to write fiction, it made me think about, like, how would I feel if I met somebody like that, and how much I take my able body for granted on one hand, and things like, I was curious about all that. So I think curiosity is a huge driver, a huge driver. I want to figure that out, follow that down wherever that takes me. And then my own being comes into play. So there, I started when it was the woman, she was not considered attractive in her town. And I think a lot of things about myself as a woman being objectified, assaulted, insulted, invaded, came through in a way there that this woman was suffering invisibly. You know, she was suffering in a way that no one could see, but everyone could see his disability. And at one point, you know, there's that scene on the mountain, right, where she says, you know, she says something
I
like,
thought what was great about
you have a spectacular, but mine is, you know, I can't just cut it out. You know, I can't just cut it off.
on the other hand, I think that character, and I saw early drafts of this story, is a terrific, a compassionate person. I mean, a person coming from a lonely place, but the fact is, she doesn't understand that this man is a double amputee until they actually go to bed for the first time, and her reaction is very patient and very well, let's see what happens. And I don't think that's a typical reaction to, I think a lot of people would be aghast and want to end the relationship at that point. But what you said about being inspired by a dream, the story Nightlight, inspired by a dream, I think that's pretty clear from the first page where he's opening up the neighbor's abandoned unit. And you describe this landscape of a hoarder's home. The place belonged to an old woman who'd passed away, and nothing had been done, and the place had been invaded by mice and was covered with what you call black confetti. It's a very powerful image, and I think from that moment on, you're in the underworld. You're in this kind of subterranean Jungian, not exactly hell, but you know, the place where the hero goes to get.
Yeah, well, that's what Heidegger said, and he finds it on the wall. It's the monstrous place to which we are all riveted. Yeah.
So to follow up on the last question, these stories often provide us with a tension between the emotional crises the characters are going through and also the landscape in which they find themselves. We saw that in Hermit's Tattoo. And there's another story that's set not in Sonoma County, but it involves the wildfires in Northern California.
It's Nevada, actually.
Yeah, and it's called The Tasmanians, and you introduce us to Mariam, an American of Armenian descent, who is actively trying to reject her family's ethnic identity. She's trying to get away from them. And she's moved to Northern California to get in what she calls a house. Her home, her last home, it's a house with no history, she calls it. And she's trying to forget family stories about the Armenian genocide and also the trauma of her father's suicide. But all of this comes roaring back to her in flashbacks and I think some dream segments. And there's a massive wildfire that it comes very close to her house and threatens it. And it triggers all these memories and puts her in a place where she has to, again, grapple with a past she's trying to forget in order to move forward. So just a quick question, how do you go about selecting a setting for a story? Does a setting itself give you an idea for a story sometimes? How does that work?
Well, you know, once again, each of the stories is different in that regard. In the Tasmanians, I go regularly to Santa Sabina in San Rafael to write. The rooms are spare, and as you can see, my room is full of photos and books. And for me to write, I really like emptiness because my head kind of feels like that bookshelf. So then I need the emptiness sort of to balance things out. So I go there, and I was there one time when I just heard up the street the cutting down of the eucalyptus one after the other, and it did something to my body. You know, when I was hearing them cutting, the sound of it cutting through the limbs, through the trunks, as though it was like my own body. And I left the convent and walked up the street, and I saw a woman up there. And so I sort of jumped from there, you know, like, what is the story of a woman? How does she get to a place where she would cut down all her trees? And does she feel it in her body? Well, I mean, what is going on? I felt this interminable sadness in the person who is doing this. I mean, I felt that. I don't know if that lady up there felt that way. She was like, whatever, you know, but I felt that in that moment. And so then I started searching around for a face, almost like, you know, I was thinking it was like a filmmaker looking for an actor or actress for a certain part. I was kind of looking for the woman in the environs who, and I found one who I could see, like, the tragedy, the suffering of her soul was in her face. And through that, I got to this Armenian American woman whose emotional crisis arises also from my own Jewish mother's denial of being Jewish. It also comes very deeply from my own experience, that struggle of who am I, and how much suffering am I going to hold on to, and the desire of her grandmother, in this case, Ozan, for her not to forget how important it is to the grandmother that she not forget, that Mariam not forget. And I'll just mention the 8 pairs of legs. I've never been to the town where that takes place in Colorado, Canyon City. But I found it somehow, and with its prisons, it's got more prisons than any other place probably on the planet, in the United States. Okay. Way up on this high plateau, surrounded by these beautiful mountains. And it also has all these churches, you know, like, so there's this godliness, and then there's this criminality, people who have killed, murdered many people. And that was permeating the air there. And somehow that felt right to deal with sort of the brutal accident that caused Callahan to lose his legs. Sort of also the brutal way many of the town people dealt with him because of their own prejudices and fears. I wanted to explore that too. I wanted to explore a small town's experience of someone who's so different from them, and what might it change that. So those were some of the things, you know, about that. And each story has its own reason. I'll mention for the Hermes Tattoo, since I read that, I was actually up at a little place where I could write in Sonoma, just outside the town of Sonoma, and I needed to write one more story for this collection, sort of bring together the theme of body memory and the ways we're marked by our past on our skin, visibly on our skin, tattoos, bruises, scars. And there was a monk there, because in the place I went, I just saw him for 2 minutes, but somehow I just took that environment and him, and that real momentary thing about him, and then all the fires that were happening, and a lot of things just came together, and I ended up writing that whole story that weekend, whereas all my other stories I spent about 7 years working on.
Well, they are wonderfully complex, a lot of them. And, you know, you may not have been to Canyon City, but I feel like you knew these characters, Harriet and Callahan, very, very well.
Because I spent so much time with them, yeah, I got to know them better every year. And
so you have a monk, you have an Armenian grandmother, you have a battered wife in the story Overture, and then you also have this philandering but nonetheless devoted husband, somewhat devoted husband, dying of leukemia, in the story called Thunder in Illinois. Mm-hmm. So we have all these different characters. Each story, I mean, there's no 2 stories that feel like they're patterned on each other or in similar patterns. They're very different people. And you've described a little bit how these characters come to you, but I wonder if you could continue in that vein for a moment. The philandering husband, right? The word game, that was interesting in that story.
Well, I think it's interesting to talk about these characters, and so there is something about spending as much time and really working on these stories, revising them, off and on over a long period of time, that I felt it was important for me to honor who they were becoming as I understood them, what was going to happen to them, and then also the art and the craft of fiction. I mean, I wanted to work with my language and all the parts of the La Grande Complication until they all were working like clockwork, but with a heart, as you said, with a soul. And that really takes time. That really takes time. In the case of the Thunder of Illinois, the man who's philandering, the long married man, Mr. Evans, the idea of having a story, in that case, it was more of a situation that came to me first. This long married couple, and it was sort of an architectural motivation, because I imagine how could I do a whole story in one night while these two are just playing this game they've been playing for like 40 years, 45 years in their marriage, this word game. And they play 3 games that night. And in that, and he has been diagnosed, well, he has leukemia, pre-leukemia, but now he's been diagnosed with, given like very few months left, but he doesn't tell his wife. And many things happen while there are memories and reveries that he goes through about the woman that he's spent time with and has loved also in Bangkok through his work. And those people were very much inspired by my own parents.
Wow.
I mean, there's certain nuggets. So people often like to know how much is autobiographical and so on. And I think that, all stories come from a very deep place in the author, and are the stories that the author needs to tell. It's something I call the writing faith, Faith. We really always write what we need to write. So it's always deeply coming from the fabric of who I am, my emotional landscape, the things that rivet me, that thrill me, that draw me for whatever reason. And I don't need to even know the reason. I just follow the seduction. And that's how so much of them begin.
I was gonna say, you also follow the subduction.
The subduction, what's that?
You go down.
Going down in deep. Well, I like to flirt with danger. And I think I realized all of these characters are really courting danger, in one way or another. And I loved it when you said they're kind of moving towards destruction. In a couple of cases, you said of themselves. They and some of them come very close, and some of them, when you leave the story, you don't know if they will be destroyed or not. You actually don't really know.
Well, I'm going to end my question with, it's kind of a long comment more than a question. And I'm going to read something from the last story in the collection as part of that. And then I'd like you to respond to that. And then I'll ask anyone who's watching has a question to type it in there under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen.
Nice.
We've had one question so far, but I think we've answered it. A question about how you possibly could know anything about a Carthusian monk living in the mountains, but
yeah, well, I can talk about that later.
Yeah. So the very first paragraph on the very first page of this collection, you describe the town of Canyon City, Colorado, this way. You call it a home rule municipality boasting 13 prisons and 50 churches. It's 10,000 people, 1/5 of them locked up, governed themselves as they saw fit, and thrived on stories, true and false, they told themselves. So one of the other things I keep running up against when I read this collection, I've read it twice now, is a sense that all of us thrive on stories, that we must construct them. We're actually compelled to construct them and to believe in them, at least for a while, I think, in order to make sense of our lives and to generally, figure out who we are as human beings.
But not all stories are not all stories are about that. But I do find that I am really interested in how important stories are for our lives, and so I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are like the story for the abused one, Margie, in Overture. Is so important to her, and for the painter in Triptych, the story she's heard from her grandfather about what happened to her great grandparents is critical, drives the story. And even Mariam in the Tasmanians, with her grandmother trying to not get her not to forget the stories. So for whether to thrive or even just to manage to survive, these stories are important. For the hermit in the Hermes Tattoo, it's the biblical stories that are he's trying to hold on to as a way of life, and in each case, the stories are instrumental and key, essential to their lives, these characters' lives. So
with that in mind, I'd like to read just a little passage out of Triptych, which is the last story in the collection, and it is about it's told from 3 points of view. One of the characters, Lynn, is a single mother who's also a serious painter, and she's telling us, she speaks directly to us about her obsession with getting down on her canvas the essence of a catastrophe that had befallen her family like 3 generations earlier. The sinking of the ship, you just mentioned it, it was carrying this family of would-be immigrants to the New World, she tells us. I had no desire to paint the tilted stern or the miniature lifeboats overloaded with male passengers. What fascinated me was the acre of ocean where the women and children went down. My mother's father used to sit me on a footstool in front of his armchair and tell me the story his father had told him. The SS Arctic, heading to New York from Liverpool, took 4 hours to sink after it collided with a smaller vessel 50 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The ship tragically supplied with rafts and lifeboats sufficient for less than half the 400 passengers. Just 7 at the time, my great-grandfather had survived together with the ship's captain, clinging to the starboard paddle box. He'd heard women and children, 250 of them, stranded on board, singing hymns as the giant ship slowly sank, then seen them shivering and scared in the cold water, huddled like mice, his own mother and brothers, heads tilted back, eyes glassy and empty, grasping at each other's limbs, trying to breathe. My grandfather must have told me the story of his father a dozen times. I dreamt about it as a child. I became obsessed with shipwrecks. What color was the ocean that night? What about the next morning? I asked my grandfather. Even after my grandfather died, I kept asking. I asked my mother, then I just asked myself. I began to draw the answers, then paint them. I wanted to find those women and children, my mother's drowned family, in pigments on my canvas. And what struck me the second time I read that is that she's actually trying to make an abstract painting, a painting of that acre of ocean that has swallowed up her family. It's again, it's this person confronting the abyss.
Yeah,
I think is another. It's not in every story, but I think it's something that recurs a lot. Or am I wrong?
Well, let's open it up to questions.
Okay. All right, a second.
If there are any. Well, I mean, I can talk about the Carthusian Monk. Was that one of the first questions?
Yeah, it was. I think you talked a little bit about, it was a question about where that came from. And
but wasn't about how I know about it.
I think that was, well, let's see. It's how you developed the character of the monk in this story. He's got such an interesting and complex background and point of view. You gave us a little bit of a glimpse of how this piece comes together, but a monk tattooing himself, that's kind of a unique thing. Or is it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, so that's why I said, I heard everyone heard me. I just saw this man for like a few minutes. He kind of welcomed me to the space, and then I went to my little thing. But everything else just I always, what I teach as they said, creative writing, and I have done that for over 30 years. And what I teach are the 6 qualities of what I call powerful or impactful writing. And those things are perception, how we see the world, smells, textures, light, imagination, love of language, courage, compassion, and commitment. And I have called myself an imagination activist. I mean, I feel it's important and vital more and more as the culture devolves for us to activate and aerobicize our imaginations so that we aren't sucked into being passive consumers of information and misinformation, but we have our own ideas. I definitely care so much. I want my imagination to be fertile, to be alive. I want the blood circulating in the imagination. So a man comes like that, and then to answer that person who asked that question, it comes to me different little pieces from different times in my life, things I know, things I look up and read about while I'm writing. I do a lot of reading while I'm writing. I do a lot of research while I'm writing. Every story, really.
Do you read fiction while you're writing, or do you read history?
No, just something that's really a lot online, and then if there are books I can find that are related to it, you know, for Overture, I'd read this before, but for example, there's a wonderful book called Women Who Kill. You know, if there's a subject area that I'm working with, it's coming from my own experience of sexual assault, but I also want to expand and deepen my understanding, and so I read.
Okay.
Is there a question?
That question was from Olga Zilberberg. You may recall.
Olga.
And Joan Frank sends this question.
Oh.
Purely curious, how do you feel about the stories the more time elapses after their appearance? Do they live on in your veins, or are they floating gently into the distance? Something else.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. Well, I was off and running into my next collection, and guess what? It's short stories, right? It's not a novel, and now everybody knows why. That doesn't mean I might not write a novel someday. So it's titled Free Radicals right now, and I have about 100 pages. So I've been very kind of immersed in those characters. And it's been marvelous to reconnect with these. Like when I just read the Hermes Tattoo, I loved it. I loved reading it and reconnecting with that person. So I think they're gonna, my sense is, I mean, this is, you know, I'm new to fiction, right? So this is my first book of fiction. These are the first stories I ever wrote. I just stuck with them. These are them. And so they're going to stay with me. They're going to stay with me, but I'm not like, they're not tugging at me all the time. Now they're just coming back for the party. You know?
Cool. I got the name wrong. I'm sorry. It was Linda DeTracy that posed that question. Or DeTracy.
Okay. DeTracy, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Thomas Schenkel sends a question. Landscapes and their effect on people seem to be a theme in several stories. Can you talk about the connection of your characters to the land and the environments they lived in? Well, we did sort of talk about that. You want to, is there anything we forgot to mention?
Well, I mean, I could talk about that for an hour or more, hours, probably.
I think you have 3 minutes.
I talked about it. I talk about it in terms of that the place of Canyon City, and a little bit about the godliness, the criminality, but the beauty, the ugliness, the technology, how that permeates everything. I love that the seasons changed in that as well. But there is this way that well, this is something I talked about at the launch, about that my sort of polytheistic way of experiencing the world is everything being alive, how the and an internal and the external are always connected. So that also is, I mean, that means that they're always going to be related, that the internal emotional landscapes kind of reflect what's out the landscape, and the landscape intrudes upon the characters. There's a relationship back and forth in that. And then also every unique person perceives things in their own way. And for example, with my students, we talk about, if you go to a park, like your neighborhood park, and you just fell in love after a dry spell, but you just fell in love, what you notice in the park, the shine on the swing set poles, the sort of a smoothness in the sand below the slide and so on, is different than if you go to that same park and you just had found out the day before that your mother has passed away.
Uh-huh.
And so there's that always an emotional thing about how we see the world totally is related to who we are in that moment and how we're feeling and what we bring to bear. And so there's this constant exchange between the outside and the inside. I believe that, and I feel it's happening in all of my stories for my characters.
Bill Issel asks, can you say more about the places where you write and why you don't write in your office?
Oh, okay.
Or do you write in your office?
I don't write in my office. No, this is where I conduct business and pay bills and do virtual readings. But yeah, if I'm in my house, I go to the back room where there's nothing on the walls, basically, just windows. And then Santa Sabina, I've been just blessed to become part of their family. They almost treat me like family. I've been able to use the priest room, even during the pandemic, because I've become like a daughter almost to them. And I'm so fortunate to be able to do that. And best of all, Bill and everybody, is when I get residencies, like at UCross for a whole month in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. I mean, in the middle of Wyoming, it's not nowhere, but there's just landscapes that extend in every direction. And in fact, there's that metaphor about the Callahan and Harriet look at each other like deer when the hunters are gone. That came to me because I was sitting in Wyoming at my desk working on that, and there they were, right in front of me out the window. It was like, okay. And so I've been up at Playa in Southern Oregon, in the desert, in the southern part of Oregon, the desert, the high desert up there, a couple times for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I'm hoping to go back in October. That's the best of all, because I like to work intensely and constantly without interruption for hours and days and nights.
And then you want to go bowling, right?
No.
Okay. So we're coming up to 7 o'clock here. We have a comment from Ann Waters that she says, I love the nature observations your monk makes and that things do come back.
Oh.
I think the time is up. Is that correct?
We're getting down to it, but I wanted to thank both of you. This was such a compelling and just warm and nurturing conversation. I really appreciate it. And we've gotten so much good feedback. So everyone else loved it as well. Just a quick note, this is being recorded. Everyone will receive an email tomorrow with the link to the recording, details where to purchase the title, the discount codes, and all the info. So if you just watched, it's okay. And I'd love it if you guys would take us out.
Do you want to say something first, Scott?
Good night, Chet. I don't know.
Go ahead, Chet.
It's been really a pleasure to read your work and to be able to talk to you about it. It's been a real treat, and I hope we can do it again.
Great, awesome, thank you, and it's been really wonderful for me to have a number of people out there that I wish I could see you, and I wish we were on the same room together. But next time we will be. But it's just a treasure. I cherish these moments, chances to be able to read my work. I listen to my work out loud when I'm doing my final revisions. I talk to you about the music of it, and so to read it out loud is there's nothing better really for me. So it's great to have a chance to do that, and so I really appreciate it. Thank you everybody again for for coming.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Blow
And we'll have you back in person in the near future.
Great, great. I'm ready.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie.